Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason, and I am here with two gentlemen who are going to discuss a very important topic of Jesus rise from the dead? So thank you everybody for showing up here. I've got two people. I've got Deconverted Man who is taking the negative. He says, no, Jesus did not rise from the dead. And I have RCA, Reformed Christian Apologist, taking the positive, saying, yes, Jesus did rise from the dead. We're going to do a formal debate here. So how it's going to work is we're going to have 20 minutes for each person to make their opening statements. Then that's going to be followed by 10 minutes of rebuttals, and then a 15-minute cross-examination for each, where each will question the other one. And then we'll have 5 minutes of closing. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. So save your questions towards the end if you have questions, and highlight my name if you have questions. And so I make sure I catch that so I can ask our speakers today. So before we go, though, let me just have each of them introduce themselves kind of briefly here. So let me turn over to, we'll start with RCA since he's going to go first in the affirmative.
So RC Apologist, a Reformed Christian Apologist with a Southern Baptist with a Calvinist spin on it. I have been doing Christian apologetics for quite some time now, and this is the first time I've done a formal debate on this particular thesis. And as she mentioned, I will be affirming and defending that position, and also the main host of a podcast called Theological Discussion that airs every Thursday. So 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. Anyone wants to tune in, there will be those shows going on every Thursday.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Deconverted Man?
Deconverted Man here. People know who I am. I'm Deconverted Man on YouTube. I'm a skeptical, jaded, I'm skeptical of whatever. And sometimes jaded, but mostly on my videos, you'll find logic and lobsters.
Logic and lobsters.
Probably more logic than lobsters, but you never know with me. So that's, that's it. I do videos when I feel like it, I guess. It's really not much more to say.
Excellent. No, I'm going to, if I don't have it already set up, I will make sure I get links in the chat to both of your YouTube channels. And I know you're both on Twitter because we've met that way. So I will also link in with Twitter, your Twitter handles, so people can reach you on social media. And so without further ado, I'm going to be timing this like I mentioned. So I'm going to turn this over to RCA, who's going to start off in the affirmative. Did Jesus rise from the dead? So without further ado, RCA, it's up to you.
And you said 20 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, making sure. So first of all, I'd like to thank SJ for allowing us to be on this format for the debate, for her channel, and then to Deconverted Man for being the one who chose and formulated the thesis that we are debating. The topic on is the first time it debated on the resurrection, and it is a essential doctrine and belief that I hold to, and especially since I believe that this particular belief is based and rooted in fact and in history. So the thesis I aim to defend is whether or not Jesus rose from among the dead. Is there any facts or evidence that we have that Jesus indeed rose from among the dead? The case shall be established using historical means, which we will examine in the biblical data, as well as examining other texts, but we will mostly engage with the biblical text of the New Testament, with treating the Gospels and even certain epistles that will be cited as historical documentation, meaning that these are documents that we can view as containing some historical facts, some historical information, and some historical background. So going into this then, let's get straight into it. But before that, actually, I would just want to point out one thing for my opponent, because since he is going to be affirming the negative, in order for my opponent to debunk my case, he is going to have to not only refute the claims that I bring forth in the opening presentation, but to also establish that the Gospels are not historically reliable with a consistent treatment of other historical sources, explain how several people of at least 500 were convinced of this account from the early conception of the Christian church within a short time after the said resurrection occurred, as well as having to prove his own thesis using a consistent methodology for history. In other words, while you have the resurrection theory, there's other different theories that try to make sense of the data given as to what exactly happened and what these apostles, disciples, and then other people who later become a part of the church, what they experienced and what theory you can propose to explain why it is that they have such experience. So some of my formal criteria that I will use be as follows. The criterion of earliness, which means that a saying is more trustworthy if it is reported in early accounts in light of the event. The next one is the criterion of multiple independent attestation, which means a statement is likely to go back to Jesus if it is reported in 2 or more independent documents. And then there's the criterion of embarrassment, which refers to sayings that are pointing to authenticity if they would have embarrassed or caused difficulty for the early church. In other words, if it sounds like it would have been embarrassing in that time in that culture, then it would probably be difficult to try to succeed in establishing this as truth and in convincing people if this was something that would be embarrassing to the cause. So start off, we have the 4 Gospels and then 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which sets forth a creed that it presents an essential truth of the Christian religion. So we have the 4 Gospels, which every single one of them mention and have a historical resurrection account. So then you have 1 Corinthians 15, which we will get into in a bit. But first, let's go into where the issue goes in with the Gospels. We have those who affirm Markan priority, which is a majority position in scholarship among Christian and non-Christian scholars, that Mark's Gospel was the first that was ever written. And this is what we call Markan priority. And affirming the whole thing we have of these scholarly views in regards to Mark's Gospel being the first and it's being the earliest. Then we have 1 Corinthians, which comes before that Gospel by nearly a decade, thus showing that with Paul, he isn't trying to borrow from any of the Gospels, but instead he is mentioning a Christian creed of history in 1 Corinthians 15. So when we can testify about this, here's the creed. Starting in verse 3, I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received. And Paul says this is something he has received before the composition of the epistle, meaning that this comes before he even starts to write this. And even as atheist scholar Gerard Ludemann notes in The Resurrection of Jesus, page 38, he says, the element and the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Yeah, and first it says, not later than 3 years. So in other words, is to be dated within the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. That's how early we can get a date of this received creed that is given. So this already is fitting the criterion of early witness in light of the fact that this tradition and this saying or this historical report goes back in early period to 2 years after the crucifixion itself. And then, of course, verses 5 and 7 mention that the resurrection was experienced by Peter, also known as Cephas, and James, who was called the brother of Jesus. This has led some to conclude with good reason that these 2 witnesses are possible where Paul received the pre-Pauline tradition form, since he mentions these 2 names and he has shown in the New Testament where he has interacted with these people, especially when Paul went to visit Peter for, I believe it was 15 days, and he learned and heard things from Peter, of which this could be dated of where he would get that information possibly. Again, this is possible, but either way, we know he received a pre-Pauline tradition that does predate even his own epistles. And then for some within the source criticism camp that affirm this particular view, there's the Q source, which adheres to the 2 source hypothesis of the synoptic problem. And while we don't have the Q document in a manuscript form, hence why Q is considered a hypothetical source in source criticism, we have to look at the connections from supposed pre-Markan material. And among the collection of those supposed Q sayings, we read from Burton Mack's recording of the Q sayings that among them, he lists Luke chapter 11, verse 16 and 29 as 2 verses that are being borrowed from the Q source. And what does these passages say that make us, want to understand this? Well, if you go to Luke chapter 11, verse 16, it says, others tempting him sought of him a sign from heaven. So far that's verse 16, but then we go forward down to verse 29, and verse 29 says, and when the people were gathered thick together, he began to say, this is an evil generation. They seek a sign, and there shall no sign be given but the sign of Jonah the prophet. So when we have Jonah that's there, and we see in the New Testament, what he talks about and reference that talks about the resurrection. So we have at least that where even Jesus himself affirms of this resurrection. And according to Patrick Harden in James and the Q sayings of Jesus, he dates this particular hypothetical source to at least 50 AD. Also, again, before the composition of 1 Corinthians. So what have we discussed so far is that 1 Corinthians 15 mentions multiple witnesses of at least 500 as well, because if you keep reading, that says that there are, besides the apostles that are mentioned by name, it says also the 500 people witnessed this and can be traced back before Paul's conversion in light of this narrative that's being pushed. So the four gospels all mention a resurrection account, and these sources cannot only be dated to the first century, but they are also, or they can be dated not just to the first century, but also you have the fact that the resurrection account is said to be about told and reported as early as in the mid 30s to the year 50 AD. These facts meet, therefore, the criterion of earliness and multiple attestation just by examining Mark being the earliest of the synoptic gospels, the Q source, 1 Corinthians 15, and our analyzing of the historical treatment of such a text and the tradition that it comes from. So we've already met the criterion of earliness and the criterion of multiple attestation. Now, let us deal with the criteria of embarrassment, which has been admitted by Stanley E. Porter in page 107 of his book. It has not been nearly as prevalent in discussion of the criteria as have some others until its recent rejuvenation by Meyer and a few other historical Jesus scholars. So while this can apply in several places of the New Testament, we will only deal with the accounts that are relevant to the resurrection. Also keep in mind that this means that embarrassment is not in a context that we are used to today, but in a context of a different time period with different standards, since I'm pretty sure as Deconverted man will agree that based on which culture, based on which country, based on what time period you're at, you're going to be dealing with different sorts of cultural taboos and limitations and things that would be considered embarrassing in that area. And this can still be seen in modern day times where we examine different cultures and their reactions to others in today's time period. So keep that in mind as we go over the proving of the criterion of embarrassment for the reliability of the account of Jesus' resurrection. So one of these incidents that fit the criteria is the fact that in all four accounts where it is discovered that Jesus rose from the dead, all of the witnesses who helped start to tell and spread the word about Jesus' resurrection have all been women. If you read all of the Gospels, you'll see that's usually either a woman or women, plural, that are about discovering the tomb. So when they discovered the tomb and discovered that it is empty and then discovered that Jesus has resurrected, they're the ones that then go and start telling it. So why is this relevant? Well, in the time period and the culture, especially considering the early Jewish context of that culture, women as witnesses were not really given much consideration. In fact, if you go to Josephus' Antiquities in Book 4, Chapter 8, Section 15, Josephus says, quote, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." So he says, don't let the testimony of women be admitted because of why? Because of the levity and boldness of their sex, because of their gender's levity and boldness. Don't take into consideration what the woman has to say. And we certainly see the Jewish people who followed Jesus had this mindset that Josephus mentions here. Because if you read Luke chapter 24, verse 11, when the women are trying to repeat back what's being said, their words seem to them as idle tales, and they believe them not. So the man apostles didn't even believe and thought it was just idle tales, just thought it was nonsense. And so why then, if you're going to include that, why try to start with women, which would fit the criterion of embarrassment as the way that you know how this thing got started is because the women saw it, and you're trying to tell other people the truth of the resurrection, but yet you start with that. And not only that, why put the embarrassing story of even them trying to tell the own disciples and the disciples who eventually start going around writing in their epistles about the resurrection, why then put such an embarrassing story where they have these doubts? It would sort of seem sort of antagonistic and different to the people. That's why Paul was given such the criticism that he was given back then. So, especially in light of the fact that you're trying to get this to a good portion of the Jewish population, of which the context of women don't have a we shouldn't consider much of the testimony of women. What if that's coming from their mindset and their teachings or their thoughts? Why then put that as a narrative, especially for Matthew, who is writing for a Jewish audience and is including that story in there? So, another embarrassing feature can be seen as the disciples doubt the resurrected Jesus when he appears before them after the account of the women, especially as we see with Thomas, who says in John 20:25 the following: "Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe." So we have, of course, doubting Thomas here, and that would be considered an embarrassing feature in light of the criterion of embarrassment of that culture. To try and preach to people that this was true in hopes that they will believe it, which people back then did believe that for the case of the resurrection, would be quite embarrassing if the early preachers of this were known to have doubts about it themselves. So not only that, but that these accounts are written in gospels for the early church to read and share with other people. And another set of accounts that fit this is the two reports of the disciples who met Jesus after he rose from the dead, and they did not recognize him. So these aren't just your average Joes. These are the disciples of Jesus, the 12 apostles who are said to have met him but not recognize him until it was too late. And so we have that for Luke 24 being one of them, or until Jesus identified himself, John 21. And this is especially the case with John 21 when Peter is mentioned in this. Peter, who is the rock who Jesus will build his church on. So even he is included in this account where he can't even recognize him until later on, until it's revealed of him himself. So with the criteria listed as demonstrated, I think, and I would hope that it is safe to argue with confidence that these documents can be historically reliable regarding the historical fact of Jesus' resurrection. Now, I only hope and propose that my opponent, in light of these facts, can go over the data that helps supports these particular cases that we make about the resurrection. And not only that, in light of the data, how then does he reconcile and come up with excusing certain these things? Because you have hallucination theory, you have the conspiracy theory, you have all these different theories that are out there that try to explain away what these people have seen, what they have experienced, and especially in the vast majority of people that have seen it. But everything I cited has been agreed by scholars to either be valid as a theory or historical data that we can use to analyze these whole things about the resurrection and how we can make sense of it in light of the theories we put forth. So I only ask that in analyzing all this, my opponent puts forth his case and his theory as to what best makes sense of the data. And in light of that, I end my time.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Sorry, I was muted. Forgot I muted myself. And so great opening. We're going to turn it over to Mr. Green. So go ahead and let's pick up on this deconverted man.
All right, deconverted man here, looking at the wrong thing. Good way to start. Okay, thanks to my opponent, the moderator, SJ, and the audience for your time and energy to do this. Today's debate is asking the question, is there proof for the resurrection of Jesus? Let me step it back from that and pontificate on that question. Is there proof that anyone ever has resurrected, come back from the dead? I mean, like dead. Sure, there's a few people that have come back from no heartbeat, maybe someone who came back from no brainwaves, but like, I'm talking super dead, like their lung is filled with water dead. That, my friends, is dead. I'm not aware of any proof of anyone ever who's come back from that sort of death. Yet here we are asking this question anyway. Did someone die and then come back to life after 2 to 3 days? If you really consider this, I mean, honestly, why are we asking if there's proof of something so absurd? We know people, when they die, tend to stay dead. You're dead, you're dead. That's it. Game over, man. Game over. But, you know, some guy named Jesus came back from the dead. Sure, why not? Seems like any other Sunday or Saturday. Yom's a heck of a word to translate. But I have to remind myself and you that Jesus is not a human. Well, not all human. It's complicated. Depending on your theology, what you think is the real true truth, with capital T, please. You might have been informed that Jesus is 100% man and 100% God. So he's 200%. Sure, why not? So God died and then came back to life. Why not? That's a good story. Gods do that sort of thing, apparently. Because magic, miracle, same thing. It sounds like a made-up story. Because it is. Imagine if we had proof, though. I mean, really honest to God, pun intended, proof. Not, oh, this person said that, they think that this thing could have happened in this story, so that means it must have really happened. No, I mean like proof that you could hold in your hands. That would be pretty amazing, but no such proof will be given by my opponent. Mind you, I wrote this, not knowing who would go first, so my opponent may have very well given that proof, but if he did, then I'm not saying this right now. Best check. Yep, I'm saying this right now, so my opponent did not give that proof, or he didn't go first. He did go first. I don't know that in the writing. Stick to the script. Okay. Remind me myself to change that during the debate proper. Don't leave that bit in. Oh, sorry. Okay, what archaeology is there about the death and return of Jesus? None. So what will be the proof? Not an argument, but a proof. I submit we won't get one. Anyway, so Jesus also, besides being God, which is kind of a big deal, but just as a side note, Jesus was born of a virgin. No, really, I'm not kidding. Again, depends on what theology, that this is all caps true. But how does that work? I mean, humans need sperm to become human, right? But maybe God teleported Joseph's sperm into Mary or something. It's God. It can do whatever it wants. So becoming its own father, it's in reason. I mean, sure. If you believe in magic, anything and everything is possible, no matter how illogical or irrational it really is. But let's be fair. I looked it up. It turns out humans could give birth without the sperm, but it's about 1 billion to 1 shot. But then, of course, there would be a natural explanation for this event, and then it would be mundane, although unlikely. But then that means the virgin birth could have happened. Also, there's some other ways that you could, if you think Joseph and Mary were really kinky, find ways to become pregnant without technically having sex. Anyway, so Jesus could have maybe been born in a mundane way that would have seemed like magic to the people at the time, but there's no way to know that a guy did that, and there's no way to know that a guy could also have done that and then died and then come back. So can humans come back from the actual dead? No, but there is a thing called the Lazarus principle that doctors have observed where they thought somebody was dead, but it turns out they're alive. Lazarus, by the way, is the other guy in the Bible that Jesus brought back from the dead. So people are just coming back from the dead left and right. So, what would be amazing though, is if somebody could come back to life from like super dead today in a controlled environment, but we're never going to see that. We've never seen it, and I don't think we ever will. We're never going to get an example of this miracle today. It's kind of a problem. All right, so if this was history, we would have to use source evaluation. This is the ability to form informed judgment about the value of a source that's to the historical topic. It answers the question, how useful and reliable is the source? So to answer that question, you have to know what reliability and usefulness refers to. Usefulness is a statement about how relevant or helpful a particular source is in providing the information about your topic. The measure of a source's usefulness is based upon the question being asked of it. If a source provides any information about the specific topic you're investigating, then it's considered a useful source. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Gospels, New Testament, Bible, that's all you got? Yeah, okay. Well, I guess it answers the question if Jesus came back from the dead in a sense. But then reliability of source evaluates whether it's trustworthy. To answer that, you have to consider the following: origin, perspective, context, audience, motive. So let's do that. The origin of Matthew is unknown. We don't know who wrote it. Oh, Mark? No idea. John? No. Not even Luke? No, that's not true. That's impossible. Search your feelings. You know it to be true. Sorry. We don't know who wrote it. Perspective. Well, whoever wrote Mark is about 70 to 75 AD. That's about 40 years after Jesus had left for heaven. That's right. I forgot to mention that after Jesus came back from the dead, he buggered off into heaven. Although I'm not sure how a solid body can go into heaven, but sure, why not? But anyway, so yeah, where was I? Let's see. What about the perspective? Well, the perspective of this person that's writing this down is probably going to be a believer. You know, there's very few people that are literate in this day and age, apparently. And so the person writing this down is either going to be paid by somebody to do it or is going to be a believer. And so their perspective is probably going to be skewed. How do we know that this isn't just myth and legend or story? There would be no way to know. Context. When was it written? It's about 40 years later for the earliest, although other things might be a little bit earlier. Audience would be other believers. The motive here, I'm not really worried that much about, and I can't really tell what the motive is per se. I would guess, speculate that the motive would have been to write down the story so that people couldn't keep changing it orally. Like, hey, did you hear about the time Jesus turned into a lobster? Whoa, that's cool. When did that happen? Wait a minute, it's not in here. Get out of here. You know, because that would have been a problem with oral tradition. People could have, keep changing it. But once you have it written down, then you say, okay, now it's not going to get changed because we can always go back and check. So that's not looking good for the Gospels. They weren't really written within a good time frame. Their origin's unknown. Their perspective is not objective. The context is late. The audience is other believers. And again, I don't really care about the motive bit. The timeline of Jesus, according to these writers, varies all over the place. Roman laws do not allow for this type of execution to take place. The story is written as an all-seeing narrative. For example, Jesus goes all alone to be tempted. Who wrote that? How? Oh, right. Jesus came back to tell them about it because Jesus likes to brag. Yeah, right. Well, why not say Jesus went off into the desert, then he came back and told us what happened? Why not include that in your writing? And of course, then we have the question of if any of this has been translated well and how much of the current version is like the oldest versions that we have. And it just depends on which Bible you use. Did Jesus come back from the dead? Not if he was human. No. If he's God, then yeah, sure. Why not? But I would also say that wouldn't be very impressive because God can do anything. So big deal. But it's mythology. It didn't happen. Not this way. Maybe somebody died. Maybe they didn't like that. So the rest of the people made up a story. Full cloth. Maybe any number of possibilities. However, I will say this. If my opponent expects me to come up with an explanation of these events, I won't do that. It's not my burden to do that. I don't have to prove any of it. He has to prove every single bit of it actually happened. And if he does, then I don't need to counter any of it because I would agree. If we had proof, I would agree. We don't. Let's see. So will we have actual proof? If he gave us the proof in his opening, then I'm not saying this because I don't know, because I wrote this before. Oh wait, I am saying it. Oh wait, I did that joke. Why did Jesus die anyways? It depends on the theology, but for most it's because Yahweh, I mean God, wants or needs a blood sacrifice. Why does God need blood again? Can't God just make blood appear? Why is it a sacrifice? Nothing's permanently lost. The story is incoherent, but God made the problem, so God can solve it. It doesn't matter if it's absurd or not. It could be absurd and still be true. But then I would reject that this is love, because from my perspective, love doesn't require blood. The sacrifice bit, I'll grant, but not blood. But people believe this story. People believe all sorts of stories. Humans are really weird. We can believe in such things. We make them normal. It's normal to think that some guy is also God, died and then came back. It's normal to think that cows are holy. It's normal to think that anything in Dianetics is real or true or relevant because other people believe it. And that makes it easier for other people to believe in it. There are mundane explanations for why people believe in such things. I once believed in such things myself. Then I wanted the proof. I looked for it and I found nothing to support it. Just bad arguments. And I suspect, sadly, that we will hear, or we will have already heard, a bad argument. I'll tell you what fallacies I spotted in my rebuttal. If we don't have empirical evidence or a repeatable test or a valid and sound argument, we have to be skeptical of the conclusions. My prediction is that we will not have any of those things from my opponent, and the burden is his. A huge claim that anyone can come back from the dead, but not just anyone, but God itself. So my opponent has to prove both God and Jesus died and came back, or that Jesus is God, or, well, I don't know. And just one more time, because the joke was so good the first two times, if my opponent already did that, then I'm not saying this now, but I am saying this now. So my opponent hasn't gone or hasn't done that yet. I don't know. It wasn't a very good joke. All right, that's fine. Oh, syllogism for this. That would be good. Premise one, if there's proof of God and or proof that Jesus is God, then Jesus could have come back from the dead. Premise two, there is no such proof. Conclusion, Jesus could not have come back from the dead. And that concludes my opening argumentation.
Okay, well, thank you. So both of you made your arguments, and I mentioned it in the chat, but I want to just let everybody know, if anyone wants to mirror this video, you're more than welcome. If you want to mirror it and make a commentary, that's perfectly fine. I'm fine with anybody mirroring any of my videos. I'll just say that out there just to open that up. But now we're going to go back to RC, who's going to offer a 10-minute rebuttal.
All right. So, first of all, I would like to apologize to the audience for the behavior that seems to have been displayed. The issue seems to be a serious debate, but instead what we've had, for the most part, has been sarcastic retorts and sometimes even veering off the trail of even the thesis of the debate. So I'd like to apologize for any of y'all that have had some of your time wasted from that, with what we're supposed to be debating about is a serious issue. Now then, continuing on to responding, is there any proof that people came back from the dead, as in dead, as my opponent has said? Well, we do for concerning Jesus, based on the eyewitness accounts of the Gospels and the early creed that is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, as well as the attestation of these early creeds and an oral tradition that can be traced back from not just the New Testament, but also from the early church fathers, some of which whom were even taught and trained by these disciples themselves, such as Polycarp, who was a student of the Apostle John. How then does it sound like a made-up story, as he mentions? Well, concerning the issue of the made-up story, that's my question. How do you come up to make it say it sounds like one? For example, in response to the whole claim against miracles from the man who goes by the name of David Hume, John Ehrman notes that in response to his argument that there'd be an Indian prince who has never heard of ice, never saw ice, but when he hears about ice, he thinks that it's made up because of how strange it sounds. He's never experienced it, and so therefore he would dismiss it. Now, Hume, in agreement, would say, well, kind of like it's not based off of everyone experience. Everyone has experiences different things, and no one at that time probably would have experienced ice, even though, as pointed out, there would be still some people that still at least experience ice and know what ice is. So just because it seems like something that is unfathomable and we haven't experienced that, doesn't mean that therefore it is made up. That would then have to say that the Indian prince is in the right because he has never experienced it and therefore he thinks it's silly and he's never seen it, and he would just be as good to be skeptical and say there is no such thing as ice. So if you want proof, as mentioned, you want proof in your hands that you can examine, well, the same thing can be done with every other historical document. The New Testament that you could put in your hands and look and read the historical documentation of certain events, just like in the same thing, we can look at other historical writings, and there are things that are debated about, and there are things that may seem strange or odd, but we don't deny that certain things happen in what these people experienced, such as, for example, in the Hadith collection, where it talks about, or even the Quran, where it talks about Muhammad seeing that the moon split. The theory that is able to be explained about this naturally is that Muhammad experienced a solar eclipse, and this is especially able to be noted if we look and the historical records that can pinpoint when certain solar eclipses happened in the past, of which would have been around this exact time period that Muhammad would A, be alive, and B, would have supposedly is said to have received the revelation for that particular surah of the Quran. And then you have the issue of Socrates. There are people that debate, was Socrates a real person? We have this person that mentions him, but we never have any writings of Socrates. We really don't have anything that can help depict him from that time period. So there are people that think Socrates may not have even existed, that he was just a creation from the mind of the supposed student of his. So we have that in regards to the issue of Socrates and other instances. So there's always something to consider when it comes to events and when it comes to trying to make sense of things that are happening there. But you can't say we don't have proof or evidence of how something happened. And so we likewise then have this historical documentation like those events for this thing. So that evidence is the New Testament, which you can hold in your hand. Now, we do know who wrote the Gospels, as we even have early church father attestation of who wrote it, and from people who even know the people that were trained by the disciples. You have Tertullian, who mentions the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then you have Irenaeus, mentions Matthew wrote in the style of the Jews, meaning that his is written for a Jewish audience. Mark, who got his gospel from Peter, in which he's getting the teachings from. Luke, who is from Paul, sets forth the gospel and gathering witnesses. And then John is the last one who is said to put out a gospel while residing in Ephesus. Then you have the Myrtonian fragment, which also, again, mentions the authorship being the same. You have Papias, who mentions the same thing. And then you have Clement of Alexandria. And so you have all of these, and these aren't just in one location. These are church fathers that are found in various different continents and areas, and they are telling the same general story, so likely that they're just making this up. Otherwise, there would be some sort of variant and difference at that point. But not only that, why choose those names? I mean, none of them were popular. If you wanted to make a popular one, why not just, especially if it said that Mark is getting his info from Peter, why then not just say, here is the Gospel of Peter? Why not just choose a popular name if you're going to make some of these? Why choose the most least known names in the Gospels or in the New Testament accounts? Why choose names that don't, especially for Luke? Luke wasn't even an apostle who was touring around with Jesus or even met and talked to Jesus as a disciple. He was just someone who was following and was with Paul during his journey, from what we read about in Acts and what we read about and hear about from the rest of the New Testament. So again, why these names then if it's made up? So not every audience was a believer, by the way, as he mentions that these were just written for believers. Marx, for example, based on the literary style that is utilized, indicates that the gospel that he is composing is for the skeptic, is for the non-believer who isn't a believer. And some say that John might be, and that's why you have people that are giving out Gospels of John to most people for evangelism these days, but that's debated about these days. Then what would be considered too late? Because the Gospels are dated first century based on the language and early church attestation of the documents. The Hadith and the biographies of Muhammad come centuries after Muhammad's death. So does that mean that there is no evidence that Muhammad existed, and therefore we must be Muhammad mythicists? So I wonder if that's what the consistent position that my debate opponent would like to take, and if anything that is said for Muhammad to have done, or the companions to have done for their contributions, are they made up as well? Concerning the issue of the composition of the Quran, concerning these particular things, these events that occurred in history, I mean, we need to examine these. Well, I do have the burden of proof, and I will admit this. My opponent likewise has the burden of proof because he is putting forth the antithesis, the statement that is going against the pro. He is the con in this particular thing, which he is putting forth the negative of the thesis. And even atheistic scholars and historians who examine this issue will agree with me that indeed the deconverted man likewise has a burden to meet. I'm willing to admit that I do have a burden to meet. And even if the situation was swapped, I would still say I still have a burden of proof to meet. And so do you. Hence why even Bart Ehrman and Gerd Ludemann have provided theories to explain them. And you actually did give one theory. So you actually have put forth something that you're trying to put the burden of proof on yourself and trying to meet that, which so far seems that when you hear words like they made it up or they made it up, who is they that made it up? Well, whoever it is fitting what is known as the conspiracy theory about the resurrection, that people conspired together to come and develop something and make it up. And so to claim it was made up is to imply that the disciples came together, and if not them, then somebody else. And if so, who? Which particular generation of church fathers? Which people in general was it that came up and made this theory? So indeed, there is a theory that you are putting forth, and you have a burden of proof to meet with it in light of the data that has been given. So again, the fact is that we have the church documents, we have the New Testament, which is historical, we have the early church fathers, who especially from the early 2nd century period, and then the 1st century, if we talk about Clement of Rome, who was one that traveled and witnessed with the Apostle Paul himself, since Clement of Rome is mentioned in the Bible in Philippians chapter 4, verse 3, even he mentions the historicity of this resurrection. So again, these still fit the different criteria. And I don't think I necessarily heard you debunk the particular 3 sets of criteria that I have, just simply said that it seems ridiculous and therefore it cannot be proven true. So I would like to know, based off of this, how can you definitely prove in light of the data your conspiracy theory? And then number 2, can you debunk the 3 criterion that I set? And with that, I end my time.
Perfect, with 8 seconds to go. So, okay, so now we're going to go over to Dan, who is going to offer his 10-minute rebuttal. So we'll go ahead and start now.
Okay. Now, a reminder, we're rebuttaling each other's opening, not, I can't rebuttal his rebuttal until it's time to do that. So, this is apparently rooted in history. Well, if we grant the Bible as history, then my opponent wins. So I don't know why we would do that. My opponent wants to treat the New Testament as actual history rather than myth. So if you treat it like a historical document, then that's it. It's history. It's not myth. I'm not going to do that. Refute the claim, establish it's not, X or Z, all these other possible explanations. I don't have to refute anything. If it is proven to be true, then I would agree that it's true. But there's no proof of it. There's 500 people that we don't know. Just it's a number. It's a nice round number too of people. There's 500 people. Really? Who? Names? Locations? Do we know who these people are? Who are we talking to? But they all saw it. Oh, okay. We know eyewitness testimony is pretty darn unreliable. So even if you could get all 500 of those names, it still wouldn't be very significant, and it wouldn't really be that surprising because people can agree upon ideas and beliefs, even if those ideas and beliefs are not true. We've seen that happen in the modern day. We've heard of, there's way back when, a group in Mexico that swears they saw the sun stop, and there's all sorts of things like this. And there's certainly a group of people that all died thinking that they would go to heaven and during the Heaven's Gate things. So people can believe in weird things. Why do they have this experience, he asks. Well, this assumes that the disciples had any experience at all. We don't know that they did. We know that we have a story about them doing that. That's all we know for sure. Early, 50 years is early now. I got sources that said that Mark is 50 years. If it's earlier than that, or if other people are earlier than that, then I guess my sources were wrong. But I'm not really going to make a big deal of the time. It could have been the day that it happened. It wouldn't change anything for me. The fact of the matter is, it doesn't take that long to convince people of a story. And we have Joseph with the Mormons to show that that's the case. It didn't take him very long to get the thing going, and he made it up. All he had to do was get one person to agree with him, and then the dominoes began to fall for that. Embarrassment. Oh, this is completely irrelevant. But here's the thing. If somebody's smart enough to write down something at that time, wouldn't they also be aware that this is a thing? Like, hey, wait a minute. What would be the perfect apologetic? To write down that women saw this. Then if somebody says, oh, you're making this up, I'd say, no, of course I'm not making it up. Why would I say women are doing it? That's silly. Of course it's true. So there's nothing about the embarrassment thing that holds any water for me, because if the person that wrote it knew that idea was a thing, they could have used that as an apologetic. Let's see. According to this and that person, because my opponent has named a lot of people, this person says that and whatever. Yeah, and why should I care what, unless we have a citation of who this person is, what their relevant field is, what degree they have, what bearing it has. We would need massive amount of citation for that particular individual. And except for the maybe one or two atheist people that have been mentioned, they're all going to be Christian or Catholic, more than likely. So they're all going to be biased. Of course, they're going to believe that the story is actually true rather than it being myth. Let's see. Okay, so he mentions meeting certain criteria, but even if that's true, that can't hope to show that a miracle happened. That's the problem of that, because if we granted miracles in this case, what other cases would we have to grant miracles using the same criteria? That's never been seriously examined by apologists, I don't think. I could be wrong about that, but nonetheless. Let's see. So why would they make up this? Why not? It's a good story. The disciples wouldn't question, Jesus, but again, that's a great apologetic. I too was a disbeliever. I was like there with Jesus, and I was like, I can't believe you're gonna die. This doesn't make sense. And then he died, and I was like, oh my goodness. And then he came back, and I was like, oh my word. It's a great apologetic tool. It's a great tool to manipulate your audience into believing you. But I'm not saying that that's what happened. I don't know what happened at all. I have no idea. It's not. I don't know if any of it actually did happen, but I have to be skeptical of the miracle bits. I could grant everything except for the miracle bits. Although I couldn't grant the impossible things like Jesus getting crucified for the crime that they say that he was, because Roman didn't allow for that. But maybe that was messed up. Who knows? Everything that has been agreed to by some unknown scholars. By the way, what does it take to become a scholar? Who are they? But even if you listed out these scholars and had an impressive resume of them, it'd just be an appeal to majority and authority. agreeing to something being true does not make that thing true. I need more than just, oh, well, but all these early church fathers said this, all these, it doesn't matter. Don't, so that will be that's rebuttal for the opening. My rebuttal to his rebuttal will be next.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So now we're going to go to cross-examination. So people, if you guys have questions or anything like that, hold your questions towards the end, because at the end, I'll open it up for audience questions. But for now, we're going to go to cross-examination, and we'll start with RC asking Dan questions for 15 minutes, and then Dan will ask RC questions for 15 minutes. So let's go.
So the first question that I would have for you is, put the timer there. Do you think that the New Testament documents contain zero historical facts in it?
I don't know how many facts it would have. I would grant that there's a couple of cities, a couple of names in there that are historical locations and people, but you have Gone with the Wind mentions places that are real, and that's not an actual account of reality, but it's completely mundane.
Let's try then the issue of Pontius Pilate being the procurator where he was. Would that be a historical fact that it got right? Is not just the name, but the fact that he was indeed residing in that particular location where he was?
Well, he was there, but we don't know. I don't know if he was there during the time of the supposed crucifixion that took place. The story's so exaggerated beyond what Rome would have done that I don't know how much we could grant or have to be skeptical of, because it has what would be a normal court hearing turn into, well, you can pick this guy to be let go, or you have to pick Jesus, and the whole thing just that they didn't do that.
Right, and I wasn't talking about that. I was just simply talking about the fact that he is there in particular.
Well, he's a person that really exists. We know that, but yeah, you can use historical names and locations.
Right.
That's all you've got.
Right, but the thing is not just simply the names and the locations, but where they're specifically at, what they are specifically doing as a result of there, and then talking about him being the procurator of there, because as you can tell from other people and accounts, there's different narratives that are made up about that. There's some people that have narratives about, Alexander the Great and all these other things. In fact, there's even different documents about supposedly Moses. There's the Torah's version, and then there's these other pagan writers that have, or not necessarily pagan, but non-Jewish authors that write something about Moses, but as a different narrative. One kind of has him as a guerrilla, militant type of leader that ends up rescuing people and trying to get them out. Then another just says that he was among them, and then he just kind of leads them out. So there's different narratives. So I was just seeing if there's at least anything that you would consider to be not just simply mere names and names of places, but actual historical facts that are mentioned within the New Testament documents.
I would say it's the time frame, to my knowledge, and I've watched many videos trying to fix the time frame of when Jesus supposedly was born and died and came back and all that. And since the Gospels are unclear on it, all these time frames don't line up. So I've not seen a coherent timeline. I've not seen an establishing of X, Y, and Z. That is known for sure. No debate about it, because these were, like I said, I grant the handful of cities and kings and historical names that are in there, but were they there at X time? Some people place Pilate actually being there. Some people say, no, he was over here doing this other thing, so he couldn't have been there. It just depends where you put the timeline. So because of that uncertainty, I have to be skeptical of a lot of it.
Okay.
Plus the whole miracle thing.
Which leads me to the next question is, do you think if miracles are mentioned in any document, that therefore the document should not be considered historical?
It's historical in that it was written in history,
but the events that are mentioned,
the miracle
in
bits,
general.
of course we have to be skeptical of miracles.
So Absolutely. It's not just so
whatever the miracle. I'm sorry.
So you're just only skeptical of that particular thing that's written down, not the rest of the document.
Yeah, I mean, the rest could be true for all we know.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that it is or isn't. Again, I mentioned Gone with the Wind has no miracle events, but it didn't happen. Something like it could have, but it's not history. Now, there might be a way that some historian could figure out if Gone with the Wind was actually history or not. I don't know. But if it suddenly had people flying on horses in the sky, at least that part we'd have to say, no, that doesn't happen.
Mhm.
And so what else is also connected to that? What else is too coincidental? What else seems like an all-seeing narrator writing this story rather than it being history that is being recorded by somebody? I understand there's different ways to record history. I'm not an expert by any means of that sort of thing. When I've listened to historians debate this, they'll agree on probably the elements that you're trying to mention, but of course the disagreement always boils down to the miracle stuff, because we have no example of any miracle at all. So we have to be skeptical of that. We can't grant it here. If we granted it here, then we'd have to grant it everywhere. And that's certainly absurd. That would lead into all sorts of insanity.
Okay. So do you generally believe that eyewitnesses are unreliable?
Absolutely.
So when police investigations or court cases are done, then they're not using eyewitnesses?
They might be, but that's a criminal investigation, and that might be the best that we have. But we know for a fact that it's unreliable. We know eyewitnesses are unreliable. This has been demonstrated many times with many different studies. I'd have to summon forth different things to produce that for evidence for you to consider. But
Right, because I've also seen studies where
that.
it also says otherwise, that it's then been
Yeah.
reliable, especially if
Okay.
we look at the statistics between when these eyewitnesses have given the account versus how much like it's actually been proven
So
correlates.
no, okay.
Mhm.
Almost asked the
So
question.
yeah, right, exactly.
Bad me, bad. Sorry.
So okay then. So how many people immediately started following after Joseph Smith, since you did mention him? Whenever he started making
Oliver
his teachings.
Cowdery was first, and then after that, I think it was his wife, and then Oliver's wife, and then there was a falling out, and I don't remember after that, because my point was only that it doesn't, it took him a few, who knows how long it took him to convince Cowdery to agree. But then it doesn't take that long to get the dominoes going. It took them a few years to get the ball rolling, maybe. But we have about 50 some odd years. And it doesn't even take that long. How long did the Heaven Gates cult people get indoctrinated before killing themselves? People can believe in this story really quickly, and there doesn't have to be any evidence of it. It's just we're pattern-seeking creatures, and if a couple of people are saying this story and saying it sincerely, that might be enough to convince somebody. We've had mundane experiments. People face the wrong way in the elevator, and somebody will come in, and the majority of the time they'll face the wrong way too. It's group herd mentality that we have built in us.
Okay.
Belief is explainable through biological evolution. I know why people believe in gods and things like this. Is we're kind of not wired, but we're geared towards that sort of pattern recognition.
So belief, the things we believe are simply the result of us evolving and having that process. So it's for our survival or to adapt.
Not everything. Some things are, and some things are not. Like our pattern recognition of faces is really, really good.
Can you give me an example of something that isn't?
That isn't what?
You say there's some things that are part of that, and then there's some that aren't. Could you give me an example of something?
I'm sorry, I might have said it the wrong way then. Everything as far as I know that we are is a result of our evolutionary process. The things that we know about, some of them are real in the real world, and some of them are only real in our heads. I guess that's what I was trying to get at. I'm not sure exactly. Can you ask that a different way? Because I'm in a different mindset right now.
I'm simply asking, like, is there anything that we have in our it's probably not I'll probably ask it another time because I still got several questions and I've got like 6 minutes to
No, that's fine.
ask
I don't,
them.
break the rules. I don't care.
So you mentioned that the authors of the gospel may have come up with an apologetical defense concerning the issue of the women in light of your objection to the criterion of embarrassment. So do you have any evidence to help support that they would have done such a thing?
No, I just said that's any mundane explanation is possible, including that one. I'm not saying that that is the explanation. I'm not saying that any of those explanations is the explanation. I don't know what the explanation is, but it's going to probably be mundane because that's all we've ever seen is mundane explanations. I'm not saying this is it and that's what I'm defending. I know you want me to, but I'm not going to do it.
So you think that with that, even though you say you have no evidence for this, it's the possibility.
Well, the evidence is that we don't have any evidence of, we have no proof of miracle events. Therefore, we have every reason to be skeptical of them. There's no logical argument that I know of for a miracle event. There's no empirical evidence, no repeatable test for one. So unless something was provided that could show us that miracle events could actually happen and do happen, we're going to have to be skeptical of it.
But this isn't necessarily about the resurrection in this particular case, but rather your objection is how then would they use the women to go about this and try and explain the women part.
Right,
so I'm pretty sure the bias that was done against women back then wasn't necessarily a supernatural or miraculous
No,
thing.
but I mean, if whoever, and it's just one guy or couple, whoever wrote it down, I have no idea who that is. Apparently church fathers agree that it was Luke, so I guess that must mean it must have been Luke then. But whoever it was that wrote it down, if they knew about that, what would prevent them from utilizing that as a great way to reel people in?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. There would be nothing. So this whole embarrassment thing just doesn't hold any water for me. I don't see it as a reason to suddenly think, oh, it must be true because they couldn't have possibly made it up with all this embarrassing stuff. It's like, look at what Trump said, but all that's true. So I could then say, well, Trump said walla walla bing bang. That's embarrassing. Must be true because I wouldn't make it up if it wasn't true. It's just nonsense to me.
And hence why I mentioned that it's the issue about the culture and the context.
It doesn't matter what the culture or context is, but
it does in light of the fact of what the criterion is specifically.
Because they would know about that as well, and they would know that that was true, and they'd be like, "Hey, look, in our culture, people don't like this, so why don't we make that part of the story?" But again, I'm not saying that is the explanation. There's one of a million different natural explanations for any of this.
Mm-hmm.
And any natural explanation is always going to win over a unproven supernatural explanation, like somebody coming back from the dead, which is in the end what it's really about. It's not about whether maybe the guy died and that's it and the rest got added in. That's possible too.
Okay. So why do you think they made the story up exactly?
I don't know.
So they made it up, but you have no idea, no reason to justify your theory that they made it up.
Well, again, I'm saying that's one possible natural explanation is that they made it up. There's a million more. But
explanations usually have evidences or argumentations to back it up.
The argument is simply, as I had indicated, that if we have proof of the positive, if we had proof that Jesus is actually God, then, well, that would also be proof that there's God. And then, sure, you could have all sorts of miracles, but we don't have that proof.
But that's the thing. You mentioned other explanations.
Yeah, there's plenty of other.
And that's why there would be some people that, even in the atheistic and secular view, they would say, well, Deconverted man, you're wrong. It's actually the hallucination theory, not the conspiracy theory.
I don't care what the explanation is. It's fine by me. It doesn't bother me. Any of them could be true. One of them might be. Who knows?
So then you're agnostic when it comes to this.
What we know is what can be demonstrated. We do not know what is undemonstrated. The proof is in the pudding, and the pudding here is invisible, intangible, untestable, and might not even be pudding.
So you're agnostic when it comes to this issue?
No, I don't. When it comes to what issue, as far as
In terms of postulating a theory that explains the data that is given.
there's no data as far as I'm concerned. You haven't proven any of it to be.
Well,
data.
so far you have gone over some of that data and tried to postulate your explanation and your theory.
Again, you're missing the point. I didn't say that X, Y, and Z is my postulation or that I'm defending X, Y, and Z. I said specifically, I'm not defending any of that. I'm saying it could all be possible. I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't matter which one is true. As long as it's natural and mundane, it's more likely to be true than the non-natural, non-mundane. So I'm not saying this is my argument. I'm saying that any of this could be my argument and it wouldn't matter because the burden is still on you, my worthy opponent, to provide proof that this particular miracle event occurred in actual history rather than it just being mythology, which I think if we use the historical method, I know you have your criteria and I found a criteria, but if we actually applied it and we applied it consistently, what categorizes something as myth? What categorizes, but I can't ask those questions. I'm not asking those questions. I'm just saying, anyways.
Well, actually, right now we're at the time when we're going to go to your questioning,
Oh,
Dan.
okay. So I am
we're
asking those questions.
So you're asking, you just asked a question, so I'm going to
No,
start
no,
the
no,
timer.
no.
Okay, we'll start over then. I'm going to go ahead and we'll start it over. And Dan has 15 minutes to ask our C questions. So here we go.
Well, maybe that is a good question. If we apply your criteria to other things, like you mentioned Muhammad, I thought we were doing a second rebuttal, so that was my bad. But at any rate, Muhammad flying on a horse, did that actually happen?
I believe that concerning the issue in a way, probably, but I wouldn't say that literally he flew on the horse. I would say that I would think that there would be some sort of hallucination that him and others probably would have experienced. Since if I'm not mistaken, it was a very minority group of people. It wasn't a mass group of people that was with him during the particular time that this happened. But again, that's only a theory I can postulate based off of the given data that we read about within the Hadith literature.
Because you are a Christian, of course you're going to think that the Christian view is correct.
Yes.
So it makes it okay to be skeptical of all those other miracle claims, but they could have happened because you believe in miracles, right? So how do you decide what miracle did or didn't happen?
Well, based on you asking me that, my view of examining this whole thing would be in the light of scripture and examining the supposed claims of where these come from and the claims they make of themselves, especially where the Quran and the Hadith claim that what the teachings they have is the same ones you would find within the Torah and the Injil, which is the Gospels. And in regards to that, we examine that they don't match up and they don't line up, especially supposedly the revelation that come from Allah directly from his words claim to have some sort of historical Jesus in mind, while they indeed don't and are borrowing from later century Gnostic Gospels and works of writing. So to me, that would sort of be basis for that particular religion's claims and its base of miracles or all these other sorts of things, especially their view of Surah 4, Ayah 157, where they try to say that Jesus was never even crucified on the cross, but that it was made to appear so. They have their own different reasons, whether it be that someone ended up looking like Jesus or that they had the swoon theory where he just kind of swooned whenever he was being crucified and he didn't actually die. All these different theories that try to be the naturalistic explanations in a way as to that incident. So based off of the theology I have for some of these in light of miracles, I would disagree on those, and also in light of also using some of the historical sort of naturalistic theories, if you will.
How many eyewitnesses does it take to make something true?
It can honestly take as many as 2 or 3 if they can correlate a good majority of the time.
So all I need is 3 people that saw an alien spacecraft, and that's obviously true then?
If the whole testimony can back up and not change over time.
Really? I can summon 3 other people besides myself to testify that the book called the Lobsterist is true, would that make it true?
We would have to examine the claims of those. Yes.
Okay. So if I get 3 other atheists, jaded skeptics to come on and we'll all agree that the Lobsterist is true, then it has to be true then?
If you can provide and actually show the whole thing about it, especially in light of what we're at
No,
today.
we're just agreeing that it's true. That's all we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just simply agreeing doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
Okay, so now it does matter. It's not that we're all saying we're eyewitnesses then.
Right. There's always a reason. That's why I even said myself earlier, there has to be certain criteria, even in the eyewitnesses, that helps to establish
we
something
know
to be true.
that all 500, it's such an odd even number, isn't it? I mean, why wouldn't it be 472? Who counted? I mean, it's just
It might not actually be 500. And that could have just
okay.
been the name that's rounded up. It could have been 521. It could have been 530 for an even number.
And
but he
no
just chose to go with
names.
that
We don't know
particular
who
thing.
any of them are. Isn't that interesting?
Actually, we can know some of the names based off of Luke's gospel as citing some of those people that are mentioned there. And he cites them by name even as he's doing so, because he's collecting the eyewitnesses to account for this. And he writes some of them by name so that people don't just simply blindly accept what he says. But if he writes it during that time period where these people are still alive, then those people can go and end up asking them, did these happen, to help corroborate with Luke, since he was writing as a historian in that regard.
You really do think that eyewitnesses can prove that something happened?
We've seen it happen in court cases all the time here.
No, but that doesn't prove that it happened. That proves that legally speaking, we find innocent people guilty and guilty people innocent. That can happen because we know the system's flawed. So
if it's always flawed, therefore we can't trust the system at all.
I didn't say that.
Well, then I don't know what some systems being flawed has anything to do with the truthness of an event happening then.
Well, but then what I'm asking, whatever. You've mentioned a number of these scholars, and I said when we had our whole little DMs back and forth that I wanted a coherent list of who these people were, what their relevant field was, citations of when, how many people do you have that agree with this, and why does them agreeing matter?
I don't have this particular survey of every single scholar that would be in the agreements with me on this whole thing. And as for why it matters, just simply because they say so, it doesn't matter, but rather it's what the data that they provide is what should be important, and we should examine that data. Just like in the case if someone says that Moses didn't write all 5 books of the Torah, then we should look into what they're saying. And I have some of those books that state that. Richard D. Nelson, for example, in what I think is the most recent introduction to the Old Testament in regards to canon and literature, he goes in providing some of these theories, and so have others today that will talk about that it wasn't Moses that wrote it. So you have documentary hypothesis and all these other different theories that are established by some sort of data that we can look at.
Don't you find it odd that God, who by the Christian religion, and maybe you have a different view on this because everybody's theology is a little bit different, but I was told when I was a Christian, God wants to have a relationship with humanity. Is that would be something you would agree with? In your theology?
Have a relationship with his people, the church.
Okay, so it's not all everybody. It's just people. Well, right, you mentioned you're kind of Calvinist, so it's like the picked people. Okay, so I can't ask about why God wouldn't just show up so that we all know that there's a God, then, I guess, right?
And I don't see how that would be relevant to this particular debate thesis,
Well,
since this is not only God exists, but rather did Jesus resurrect.
Yeah, but you can't have somebody coming back from the dead unless it's a natural explanation, right? That would be the only other way to resolve it. And if we had one, like if I said, well, Jesus is Wolverine, there you go, there's your explanation.
Okay.
And if we had an actual example of a Wolverine type of person, the X-Men that regenerates, right? To mention, not to name drop, but J.P. Peterson sounded like he was trying to come up with an answer to a mundane way to understand Christianity. Is like, do you think Jesus really came back from the dead? He's like, I don't know what the human body can do. It's like, so you think like, and I'm like, wait, does he think like Jesus, like just his body naturally healed itself? I mean, it would be some sort of weird, rare genetic thing that allowed that. But, you know, if that was the case, then the story wouldn't really be that cool anymore if it was just mundane. So it has to be that Jesus is more than just coming back because that's something that was rare. It has to be that he's God or from God or of God or something of that nature for it to matter, right?
It would be sort of a thing that could probably be there, but even then, even some of the non-Trinitarians would try to explain it away as if that he did resurrect not because of anything that he is or did, but rather that it was the work of simply the Father. And I think even then, that's what the resurrection account sort of depicts, that it's because of the Father that he is resurrected.
So even if there's a natural explanation that we could uncover, it would still ultimately really be God that did the natural explanation?
Well, no, because by nature, natural explanations are considered naturalistic and built from a naturalist worldview, not from anything that it would be supernatural. When I mentioned the Arians or the modalists or some of these others, they would be going about it where the Father's the one doing this and the Son isn't, but they still affirm that there is a supernatural view where God exists.
And I think this will be my last question. Do you have any empirical evidence, repeatable test that a miracle has happened in a controlled condition that we can observe?
I don't think I have one that I can recall and put on forth. The only thing that I have is a mention of a resource is that Gary Habermas is writing a book and soon to produce it of a 5,000 page document on the historical evidence for the resurrection.
That's not what I asked. I said
I know, then that's why I said I didn't, then that's why I only just mentioned that in passing.
Right. Okay. So no is the answer then. We don't
Exactly, as I said. As I said.
Have you ever
yes.
seen a miracle? Oh, I said was my last question. I lied, I guess.
Right,
Sorry.
none that I can think of off the top of my
Okay.
head, no.
All right. I think that's it. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
Because my memory is vague
Yeah.
anyway, so it probably has happened, but I just can't really remember it.
Yeah.
So is that the end of the questions?
I'm good. Yeah. Is there any for the audience at all?
The audience has a lot of questions, but I still have the 5-minute closing. So I've been copying and pasting their questions into a form. And I want to thank everybody for the super chats, but I'll mention those as soon as we oh, do you guys want to do a closing?
No.
I'll do a closing.
Okay, I guess I'll.
Okay. All right. So, okay, we'll start with then. We have 5-minute closing and from RC.
Okay. So in light of the debate, just keep in mind that this is not something where I'm saying you must automatically accept what I'm saying. Don't just blindly accept what I'm saying and therefore, resurrection is true. Look into the whole thing for yourself, which is something I'm hoping that everyone should be doing, that they examine this, because I actually know one guy that was a big skeptic, big atheist, and then he eventually started looking into the matters of Jesus' existence, and then eventually the crucifixion, and then eventually see if the resurrection is true. And based off of his research from an atheist to eventually being a theist and to being a Christian, we now have one of the co-founders of Sentinel Apologetics, that being of Hunter, who is now a Christian because he has looked into it. He didn't just blindly accept what a pastor said, what a particular scholar said, but rather he looked into the information and examined it in light of using historical methods. So the fact is that don't just blindly accept what I say or what Deconverted man said. Look into the stuff for yourself. Examine the New Testament documents for yourself. And if you need to, even go to some of the scholars to help you go through it, whether it be those who put forth their own naturalistic thesis or even those who have the resurrection theory. Look at every single one of the theories and then ask yourself, in light of all this, which one actually makes the most sense given the data, which one actually can help explain everything in light of the data. And so far, from what I believe with confidence that I have given you, is that in light of everything, the only theory that can actually make sense and account for the majority of what we have laid forth in our argumentation, in light of what the data is, that it is the resurrection theory, that Jesus rose from the dead, that makes sense of all of this. And not just for a historical purpose does this make sense, in my honest opinion, but also the fact that, listen to this, if this is true, recall what the creed itself says, because 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I only stated verse 3, where it talks about the fact that he is declaring what he received. What is it that he received? How Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures. So not only was it the issue that he's receiving this tradition of simply the resurrection, but the purpose of it all, that he has fulfilled the messianic prophecy, is fulfilled of in the Old Testament, that he is the Messiah that is to come, and that he died for the sins of sinners, so that it's through him we may have eternal life, that we may have salvation. It is not simply just to be mere rational thinkers, but rather that we are rational thinkers who know and examine the data and are saved because of the gospel, because of what Christ himself has done on the cross. So I leave that with you to consider the gospel and to consider the data and examine the evidence for yourself. And with that, I end my time.
Okay, well, Dan, did you want to offer a 5-minute?
Oh, yeah.
Final?
Yeah, sure. I agree that we should examine everything. Absolutely. But I think we should go further. We shouldn't just look at the Bible as is today, because every translation is a little bit different. I recall there was a program called eSword. I think it's still around, and you are able to download multiple different versions of the Bible and even some of the older translations, and go back as far as you can and look at all that. Look at the Torah versus the Old Testament. Is there any difference? Look at what the Jews have to say about their idea and why they don't think that Jesus counts. Look into everything. If this book, the Bible, has been claimed to be the most important book in the world, then treat it like that. Yeah, people don't. They don't know, even who published the Bible. Like who is the publishing company? You should know everything there is to know. All of the history. Look at the archaeology. Dig. Don't just look at apologetic websites. Look at everything you can. I feel like I need to mention the unseriousness. That was a strategy that I decided on pre-debate. It's up to the audience whether they liked it or not. I can understand both sides. I've usually done serious always in the past, so this was a one-off for me. Being skeptical is a great thing. It's a great tool. We're skeptical of a lot of things. My opponent seems to be skeptical of certain things too. I just don't think he takes it far enough. My good message is sin is made up. There isn't sin. You have nothing to be saved of. Being a good person is good because that's just the word is a tautology. And we are all we have, we humans. So help each other out. Love as much as you can because we're all we got. And this life is all we get. And so the good news is you don't have to worry about sin. Bad news is there's no bonus after this, as far as I can tell. And if there is, well, then we'll celebrate it then. But let's try to make this world a good world together. And maybe we don't need religion. Maybe we do. Maybe it could be secular. Maybe it could be the lobsterist. I don't know. But whatever it is we do, we humans must do it because we're all that there is. There isn't a God, or if there is, might as well not be one.
Okay.
That's it. I'm done. Yeah.
Okay, all
Lobsters.
right. Well, thank you, both of you. Thank you so much for your very thoughtful debates. I can tell that both of you put in some time on this, developing your arguments. I could see that you were able to very politely address each other. I really appreciate that. I think this was a really a good debate for a lot of people. And I noticed from the audience, a lot of people like the format. And so that's just great. I have a bunch of questions that I've been collecting from the audience. So let me just hold on one second. I'm going to
Bring
go
it
over that.
on. Oh, sorry.
Bring it on. Okay, so John Lloyd I'm first going to go through a few super chats. John Lloyd had a super chat. He said, has anyone listened to the testimony of former atheist professor Howard Storm, who died, went to hell, and was saved by Jesus? Please watch. Any of you heard of that story?
Howard Storm, was it?
Yeah, Howard Storm, who was an atheist professor. It says he died, went to hell, and was saved by Jesus. So have either of you heard of that? Okay, so something to look into. And then Stephen Steen also was in the super chat, and he said, Alpha Daddy has just entered the chat. And so he has this really funny relationship with James of Modern Day Debate. So
Welcome, Alpha
probably
Daddy.
explains it.
All hail, Alpha Daddy. We're
they
not
tease
worthy.
each other all the time. It's really funny.
Do we get any of the super chat money? No.
Yeah, I should actually, when I finally make the threshold that for YouTube to actually, I'm going to start giving back my super chats to different charities and things like that of the people's choices. So I'm going to do that one. So and I want to say Stupid Horror Energy, who's actually Sarah, so she calls herself that, for a super chat at $10. She says, how much can we reliably know about Jesus of history from the Gospels in the light of psychological research on the inaccuracy of memory and eyewitness testimony? So that might be for RC.
Right. And so I would disagree with the claim that it's that the oral tradition would be unreliable, because as I've stated in other debates on the whole issue about it, that oral tradition, particularly not just in the Jewish context, but also in the Greco-Roman world, was very strong. In fact, the teaching that was emphasized and is shown by some of the early Greco-Roman philosophers is shown that they would, instead of teaching with like having notes on hand like we do here, or taking down notes in an audio form so that way we can always go back and look at it, they didn't have that kind of technology. So the way that they would have it done is that they would train their memorization skills, which can be done today if we would decide to do such a thing. And we can examine, based off as well, these scholars who examined the Greco-Roman world at that time, that these would be people that were able to memorize speeches, to memorize entire wisdom sayings and poems and recite them back word for word. And as Mary Carruthers notes in her book, The Book of Memory, if you were a person who didn't have this high skill, is basically, quote, a person without memory, if such a thing could be, would be a person without moral character and in a basic sense without humanity. So you're basically seen as less human if you weren't able to memorize whole things. And even Josephus recorded in his writings, according to David M. Carr, that he recorded that Jews could recite their laws easier than their own names. This is found in pages 247 to 249 of David M. Carr's book, that Jews could recite the laws easier than they could even recite their own names. So back then, at that context, especially if we know what time Josephus was, that, yeah, oral memory was a very strong thing that was going on at that time, especially for the Jewish context.
And now, remember, we'd agreed that we could answer either question.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Just want to make sure. My answer to that question would be very little, because memory can be flawed. There are certain things that will progress, even if you do the telephone game, or there's this thing I've been playing called Drawception, where you draw what the person writes and the person writes what you draw. There are things that will carry over, like, no matter what. But what that is hard to find. And then, yes, I suppose you could develop a way to memorize it, and maybe you could even get your society to do that. But how reliable that is, I have no idea, no way to know any of that. But considering that China had a lot of literacy, God could have gone there and had plenty of written documents. but he chose a place that was illiterate. He could have taught his people how to write. That would have been good, but he didn't. It's kind of odd. So.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me ask you this. I've got another. Well, John Lloyd, he also was a super chat, very generous. My office accountant told me that her 5-year-old daughter had pink eye. They went to the hospital. Doctors didn't help, went home. At one point, she went to check on her daughter. Daughter said the man fixed my eye. So it sounds like the daughter must think that there is some sort of miracle possibly. Do you have a comment or thought on that?
Well, it says the man fixed her eye. Doesn't.
Yeah, so the 5-year-old daughter went to the hospital, doctors didn't help and went home, and then her eye got fixed, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean.
So that's something to think about. Then we have Stupid Horror Energy. Sarah, she also did a super chat. She said, raised on the third day according to the scriptures. If this is a reference to Jonah 1:17, what does it have to do with the resurrection?
Well, I'd say that would have been a reference to there. What I said was in Luke, where the citation is for where it's being referenced to about the 3 days and 3 nights, because that's what Jonah 1:17 says, that a great fish swallowed up Jonah, and he was in the belly of fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And I think this is in reference to that's how long Jesus was in the grave after he was crucified. And so it's on the third, basically after all these periods passed, that's when he then rises.
I would say that the Jews, and probably this is a hypothesis, very weak, that early Christians might have also adopted numerology. Jews loved numbers, 3, 7. You'll see numbers all over the place, and so certain numbers were sacred. So that might be why it says 3. It's just because it's a sacred number.
Okay. And then how about Sahi Luke says, question for the person against the resurrection. That would be DC. Why do you reject the Gospels as historical documents when historians use the same criteria for them as they do all other historical documents?
Well, historians don't use the same criteria as they do for all historical documents. Only the criteria used by the scholars and all of this are essentially using a different method on these things. So the question is loaded. It assumes something that isn't true. Many historians have nothing to say on the Bible because it's just not within their scope of interest. So you're only going to find certain historians that even talk about it in the first place. And then if those historians happen to be Christian or Catholic, then they're probably going to be biased towards it. And therefore, you should be adding a bit of skepticism to what they say, not, just as you would for any other religion out there.
Okay. Did you want to comment on that, RC?
I'll just simply say that, I would disagree that it's been used as a historical document. In fact, even Bart Ehrman mentions that we were able to treat it like such in his book, Did Jesus Exist? Where people say we can't trust that even for things like that because it's a book that mentions miracles and all this sort of stuff. It's fiction. It's just made up stuff. And so therefore but we can examine and try to look past the miraculous natural claims to examine it and treat it with historical criteria, which I think is what the person was referencing. So yeah, we can use it for historical criteria in the same way we can examine every other book. Because like Herodotus is filled with miraculous miracle claims and all that kind of stuff, but yet he's considered the father of history with regard to how he examines and does things in his writings as history. So I think that, yeah, it's a historical document. And I think if Deconverted Man looked into it, he wouldn't disagree. He would just disagree with some particular events that may be recorded in there as historical, while not necessarily discrediting the New Testament as not a historical document.
Okay. And I wanted, John Lloyd just did a super chat and he says, has Deconverted Man researched William Tyndale?
No.
No. Okay. Well,
If he
thank
gives
you.
me an argument for why I should, then I will.
Okay, well, maybe he'll put a little bit in here about that. Mouse Forever says, for RCA, the claims of the resurrection are claims, not proof. Can you establish supernatural miracles using written documentation alone that would stand up to scrutiny in a court of law?
Well, I think I have within the case of the New Testament themselves. In fact, that's why some scholars would say if you were to provide these in a court of law, that would be able to be taken and verified as so. And if we want to be that skeptical just because of that the writings, therefore, that are said to be eyewitness and all this aren't claims, then we must say, so the claim of Socrates' existence is nothing more than a mere claim, or the claim of Jesus' existence, it's nothing more than a mere claim. Show me something that is in writing that he actually existed. But if the writing itself that testifies of it is just a claim, then how can, therefore, you ask for something which, according to your words, is supernatural miracles using written documentation alone be evidence if you're just going to therefore dismiss the evidence? It's like saying prove that the White House is white, just don't use the White House to prove such a thing. To me, that's sort of what I get whenever I hear that kind of a question. So I think I have established that during the debate in using the written documentation.
Okay. Okay. Now I've got,
Nope,
oh, sorry.
nope.
I've got a question for you too, Dan. Did you want to
Yeah,
answer that
yeah,
one?
no,
though?
yeah. It was. Now, can you repeat the question again? Because it was just in my mind and it went.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So it was holding up in a scrutiny. Let me see. The claims of the resurrection are claims, not proof. Can you
Oh,
establish?
right. Can you establish it in court of law? Right.
Yeah.
Well, maybe because law is different than the scientific method. And so I could see a group of atheists and theists decide, let's put on a courtroom trial, and it could go either way. It wouldn't prove it in that sense. A courtroom trial doesn't prove things in the same way that science might be able to prove a thing. So you might actually have a victory for Christianity in a trial. You might have a victory for any claim in a trial. And creationists have won at least one trial in the past, but then of course we beat them later on. So who knows? But I would say it's instead of using the whole trial thing, I'd rather go with a more formalized method like science or logic itself.
Okay. Okay. So then this is another question for you, actually, from writer John Buck. He says, are all personal testimonies unreliable? If yes, is the testimony of atheists saying they lack a belief in God unreliable? If no, what makes a personal testimony reliable?
No, you should be skeptical of everything.
Okay. So what makes a, so you said no. So then he wants to know what makes a personal testimony reliable? How would you?
You have
So
to be
there's nothing.
skeptical of everything.
Okay. Okay.
Good luck, John.
Right.
John
then,
knows why I answered it that way. We have fun. So
Sahi Luke follows up here with question for you again. It says, why do you think non-biblical records such as Tacitus?
wait. He might have wanted to say something about that.
Oh, see if
Yeah.
okay,
I'm good. I'm good.
Oh, he's good. He's good.
Okay. All right, sorry about that. And yeah, if either of you want to, if someone asks somebody else's, and okay, so here we go. Sahi Luke says, why do you think non-biblical records such as Tacitus making mention of a mysterious superstition regarding Christ that broke out in Judea? Why do you think that there are these records like Tacitus?
Well, Tacitus, there was a debate about whether there was some forgery or not. I don't know if that ever got resolved. I haven't looked on it again since I looked at it, which was years ago. But yeah, I mean, I think he mentioned that these people believed that this stuff was going on, not that this stuff was going on. So there's a key difference. Like, did he say, I was there and I saw this stuff going on? Or does he say, I heard about the people are saying this stuff is going on? But even if he said, I saw it, it's just, again, it's not, we have to be skeptical of it being a supernatural thing. It could be, what is that? What does it even mean to be supernatural? There's a lot of problems in that. So that I'd say no, that would be the answer to that.
Okay. And then John Lloyd wants to finish out who William Tyndale is. He says he was executed for translating the Bible into English despite being outlawed. Estimates say 70% of the King James Version is his English, William Tyndale's English. And the Vatican tried to murder KJ for finishing WT work. So KJ, I'm not sure who that is, but try to murder somebody
King James,
for finishing.
probably.
Oh, King. Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, was this the one that
My
was
bad.
burned at the stake and then burned
60 years later?
Yeah, if he's
I
the
think
one.
I have heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I might have, because I saw a documentary on how they got the Bible into English. Very interesting. But if it's the guy I'm thinking it is, they burned him at the stake, and then later the church burned him at the stake because the church didn't want it translated. And then later, like, because it was so widespread, they dug up his bones and then burned it again because they were so mad at him. It's like, that will teach you, now you're dead. You know, it's like, wait. But yeah, so I have heard of him if that's the guy, but if not, I just don't know the name off the top of my head.
Okay, so yeah, I think I have heard of that. And John Lloyd just added on, Deconverted Man will SC one of your vids and videos, I'm sure that means, but we'll see one of your videos, I think, is what he's saying. So he did a super chat for that. So thank you, John Lloyd. It says one of your videos. So he says, will SC one of your videos. Maybe I'm thinking might be.
What? I don't know what that means.
Oh, it's like the letter S and C. So I think I'll watch the chat and see if he specifies what he meant right there.
I don't know what you're saying.
And he did say, yes, it is King James. So KJ, of course, I should have thought that. Sorry.
Yeah.
JB wanted to know, RCA, did you just admit group hallucinations could happen? Did you admit that?
I think it's only possible, most likely, if, like I mentioned regarding the thing with Muhammad and the incident, that if it's in a minority kind of thing, and that's why I think it would have probably been there with regard to there. But I said that's only what I think of at the moment. I haven't looked too much into the whole story about the narrative of the night flight with Muhammad. I know there's been books from scholars, both Muslim and non-Muslim, in the Orientalist field that have examined these things. I haven't gotten around to it. I'm still waiting for the historical critical introduction to the Quran to appear in the mail by Nikolai Sinai. So I'm still in my debate or my studies in the Quran, and then I'm going to eventually start moving to the Hadith, which that's where that particular story is found. So I'll look at that and see if that's probably a likely explanation in light of a minority thing. But again, I'm still agnostic about that.
Okay.
I would say it's unclear as far as hallucinates. I think it's kind of too broad of a term, but I do know that there have been more than one studies done on what happens to large crowds, say during a riot, like back when Rodney King riots, for example, that you had these people that were just normal people, and then they reported later they don't know why they were rioting. They don't know why they were looting. They have no idea why they were participating. It's just, they just did it, and they have no idea why. And so that's maybe what might be going on, is because other people are doing it, you start to do it. And if they report feeling a certain way, maybe you'll report feeling the same way. There's been tests done where they'll have 4 actors all give the wrong answers to a question, and the 5th person who isn't an actor will start to give the wrong answers, and then they can fill that up with new people, and so you get a room full of people that aren't actors all giving the wrong answers. So there is something about being in a group and group mentality that we have to be very aware of. That's both a pro and con of being human. We can use it for good or evil, or nothing. And so we just have to be aware that that's a thing that we can do.
Okay. And I think that's groupthink. And I saw something similar to that where somebody would walk into an elevator, and if everyone's facing the wall, they would turn around and face the wall too, which I thought was kind of funny.
Yeah.
So actually the word SC from John was super chat, and he said he is going to subscribe to your channel and give you a super chat. So just wanted to.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I'll get it or not, but okay.
Okay. So, so here we have, let me just see one. Okay. Sahi Luke says, for the person against the resurrection, are you aware that pagan, Greek, and Roman historical records all allude to the resurrection? Why strong agreement with the biblical account? So why do these
I don't know what he's talking about, so I'm not aware.
Well, probably like Josephus and Tacitus. So why
Well,
are there
Josephus
these?
wasn't pagan, though.
Or
Yeah,
did he say Jewish? He didn't say
Yeah.
Jewish. Okay, you're right.
I'm not sure
So-
who he's. I can't answer the. I mean,
Okay.
if he wants to ask me, he's free to email me or Twitter at me.
Okay.
Deconvertedman1@gmail.com. I have all my info on my about page on my YouTube thing. So if you want to clarify that question and ask me, I'll give the best answer I know.
And I'll put links in the description.
Yeah, I
for you.
can't answer that right now in that format. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, then we go to writer John Buck has a question for RC. If the simulation hypothesis is true, would that provide an explanatory account for Jesus's resurrection by being revived from the programmer with a naturalistic frame?
Wait, repeat
That's
that
from
again.
Stephen Steen. Or wait, is that from Stephen? No, that's from writer John Buck. Then I'm going to go to Stephen Steen after that. So if the simulation hypothesis is true, would that provide an explanatory account for Jesus's resurrection by being revived from the programmer within a naturalistic frame?
If we go based on that, I'm not too familiar with the whole simulation theory, other than it's basically just the matrix, trying to apply that in real life. I think that would be something, if it was true, if we go with that hypothetical, would be a probable explanation, provided that if we grant that it is true. I'm not saying that it is, but it would be an explanation that would be able to demonstrate and prove that.
Interesting.
John, that made me laugh.
It made John laugh.
It's all
Yes,
a
John actually-
simulation.
A lot of people in the chat here have great channels, by the way. So writer John Buck is one of them. So recommend visiting him. Stephen Steen says, question for DM, that's you. Deconverted Man, 1 Corinthians 15:6 states clearly more than 500, but your rejection of that was, why exactly 500? Seems
okay.
suspicious. So
Well, I mean, I mean, it's usually set as 500, but more than 500. So not it doesn't say the number. It just says more than 500.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
How about a specific number? That would, but again, kind of, it's moot. I'm just saying it's kind of odd. We don't have an exact number.
And I have one last question coming in from Gavin Hurlman. It says, why did the Pharisees and Jewish chief priests not issue a formal document refuting the resurrection of Christ? So it sounds like that's for Deconverted Man again.
Mm-hmm.
Why would they need to?
So
Why would they care? It's like with it's like there was other religions, other groups at the time. Why would they care? It's not government business. It probably went under their radar. Why would they care? Why would they bother? Or you're talking about the Pharisees or whatever. Maybe they did. I don't know. But
Okay.
it's just this. Why did this people do this or that? Who knows why people do anything?
Okay.
It seems to be a loaded question, so
he says,
I'd have to
why?
look at it closely.
Then I've got one more, it looks like, that just shot in here. Mouse Forever says, for both of you, isn't it more reasonable to say the biblical accounts attest to the fact that people believed they saw something and something actually happened? Is it more
Okay,
reasonable to say that?
so it's more reasonable to say the biblical accounts attest to the fact that people believe they saw something. I think that's something that, I don't know, maybe me and Deconverted Man could probably agree on. But then the next part is that something actually happened. I would say, yeah, both of the things, that they saw something and then it actually happened. Rather the identity of it, what it is, that would be a difference for Deconverted Man. But I would affirm that is indeed referring to the fact that they did see Jesus, they did see the resurrection, and therefore would be a good, viable eyewitness at that point.
Well, and I'd have to agree that it is at least saying that somebody believed that they saw this, at the very least. I have to grant that. Whether it actually happened or not, who knows? I'd have to be skeptical of at least the miracle bits, which you could and people have removed those, and you still have a decent story. It's just not magical anymore. Who was it? Did the Thomas Bible or Jefferson Bible or something like that. Yeah, with, did it happen is the question. Did it really happen for real, or did just people believe it happened? And I think people believed it happened, but did it happen?
Okay, that's fair enough. And I just want to point out a couple of things. Modern Day Debate says Stephen Steen has been engaging in toxic masculinity. And then Prophet David says, my beard is toxic masculinity. So got some funny people in the house.
My
okay.
beard is toxic masculinity, and it will fight you to the death.
Tell you what, right? So I want to thank both of you for coming on my channel. We planned this a long time ago. I can tell that both of you have prepared and you were very polite, formal. It was a nice conversation. Maybe we'll do it again. It's up to you two. And
I'll do it seriously with no humor if I do anything again with RC. It was just a tactic. Whether it's successful or not will be up to the audience. I don't know, but
it always depends on who you go against. I'd say.
So who knows?
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. And last question, formally informal. It's actually Joel. He's one of my friends. He says, "Are you skeptical of your own skepticism?" I'm sorry, I'll slip one more. Okay. So
I've done a video on that. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to put links to both of your channels. I'll put links to your Twitter accounts, and I just put, your Twitter names and that kind of thing. Did you two want to say anything, another shout out before you go on what you're working on now, or anything that you'd like to lead people to?
Just that at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time, we will be doing a podcast theological discussion. Me and my co-host Aid, and tonight's guest that we're having on is Turretin Fan. And we'll be discussing over the just a short interview about what he does, and then have him on to discuss the Apocrypha.
Great. And Dan, did you want to share anything you're working on, or?
I'm not working on anything in particular, but I'll say what I usually sometimes always say at the end of my videos. Unless and until we have empirical evidence, a repeatable test, and or a valid and sound argument, we must be skeptical of the conclusions.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate everybody coming in here today. We had a pretty good crowd for my channel. My channel's pretty small, but but please like and subscribe, and do choose to come again. And I'm going to go ahead and end the stream now. So thank you so much, you two. Stick around for a sec. So let me just